Good morning. Welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman. Today I'm going to be working on a crumb quilt. I have been working on the blocks for the last couple of months as we have been going through my Strip Up Your Stash series. And I'll link those videos below if you'd like to see those. But I've been creating quilt blocks from the crumbs, the leftover parts and pieces, as I've been going through and creating those Strip Up Your Stash quilts. And these are some of the blocks that I've worked on. I'm sashing each of them with the light value crumbs. And then, of course, I'm trying to make the blocks themselves more of a medium dark value, so there's a contrast. I do have a top border on this, and this is all sitting on a board, a design board here in front of another quilt. But this is what I've done so far. I have 10 blocks, and I have them sashed. And I'm going to share with you today how I've crumbed up these blocks, how I've crumbed up my sash. And I'm also going to share with you how you don't have to use crumbed sashing. You can simply pull some sashing, some fabric from your stash in light values or whatever values you'd like to use, and sash them all together and use some fun borders. Maybe you'd like to make this type of quilt for a generosity quilt, a baby quilt, a neonatal quilt. You could add some really fun baby fabrics for the borders and or the sashing. So let's see how this is done. Before we get to the tabletop, I wanted to show you a couple of things. I pulled some fabrics from my stash. On this, I pulled from my children's themed fabric stash. So I have some really fun fabrics that I could use for borders to make this a child's quilt, just all kinds of fun things. And then you could simply grab a light colored sashing fabric to go with that. And that would make a great quilt. Many quilt guilds like to give the neonatal quilts, the generosity quilts. We like to donate quilts to different organizations within our communities. And that's a great way to be able to accomplish that. You're using up your stash and making a really fun project for someone else to enjoy. And another thing I wanted to point out, if you look at the blocks here, when I started putting these blocks together at the beginning a couple months ago, I wasn't paying too much attention to what I was putting on the inside of the blocks. And as you'll notice here, I've got a number of light fabrics, light valued fabrics within this 7-inch block. And it doesn't pop as nicely as some of the darker ones. You'll see this one pops a little bit more nicely within the light sashing. So that's something to keep in mind as you're crumbing up your quilt blocks. If you want to do something like this, try to keep in mind as you're making up your blocks to keep them more of the medium dark values and then save all of those light fabrics for your sashing. So let's take a look at some of the things that I'll be working with today. First of all, I have some of my blocks that I have created over the last couple of months as we have been going through my Strip Up Your Stash series. Some of these have a nice dark feel to them. This one, I guess, has one light square on the outer corner. This one has a little bit more light. This one has a lot of light. I was using up those wacky half-square triangles. And just to let you know, or just to remind you, these blocks won't show up quite as well, or it won't set off the sashing as well because of all the light that's in there. So I might hold this block out and work with the rest of the blocks. We'll see about that. These are the sashings. These are 7.5-inch sashings that will be placed in between all of the blocks. These are 2 inches wide, 7.5 inches long. These blocks, I've cut them down to 7.5 inches. I'd crumb them up to about 8.5, 9.5 inches, and then I would use my square up ruler and square them up to 7.5 inches. So each one of these is 7.5 inches. These are 2 inches, and they'll end up being 1.5 inches in the quilt. I do have some border straps here. I like to use whatever I can from my stash. And I had a chunk of this fabric that's just enough to create the borders that I'll need for this particular quilt. This one that I am making is going to be 5 squares by 4 squares in the grid or the layout of the quilt. And so that is what I'm going to be using. These are my baskets of crumbs, and I did separate them. This helps me so that I'm not grabbing lights when I'm trying to make my center blocks, and then I'm just grabbing from the lights when I'm making my strips. and I'll show you how I put those together and how I put the squares together. If you're interested in learning how to scrap up your stash, I do have a book set and a video on my YouTube channel that you might want to check out. The video I'll link below, as well as these books. This is my techniques book. That video walks you through this techniques book step by step, teaches you everything you need to know to cut, sort, organize, and store and then use your scraps. There are a total of 17 scrappy patterns between these two books, so you can check that out if you're interested. Now let's check out how I put together my blocks and my sashing. So I'm going to start with the darks, and what I like to do is pull out the smaller chunks and pieces from my stash here of crumbs, and I'll use those first to create the center of each block. And so I've grabbed a few here. I can put these two together, and I like to do this assembly line. So I'll take that to my machine and I'll sew that. I can sew these together lengthwise. I'll put them right sides together. I might need to add this piece on there before I do that, so I'll put that up by my machine here in a minute. I've got some of these leftover half square triangles are kind of wonky, or they haven't really been squared up. So I'm going to go ahead and use them. So, and I'm going to make sure when I put it in my block that I keep it in the center so that it's not conflicting with the sashing. I want the lights to stay in the middle of the blocks if I'm using that, and then light around in the sashing. So I can put this together. I'm going to do this, as I said, assembly line. I'll show you that in a minute. This other one here, I can end up putting on the opposite side of that. Here I've got a piece here that I can add to this, unfold it. Now you'll notice I don't have anything pressed right now, and that's okay. I'll do my first sewing or assembly line here as I continue with this, and then I'll press them as I open them up and trim away excess seam allowance. You'll see this here in just a second. But let me get started on how I do this. These might all end up in one block, or they might be 5 separate blocks. I never really know until I get started. So let's see what happens. So here we go. The first thing I think I'm going to do is add this piece to the end of this. Some of the little chunks don't exactly match. That's okay. I will end up trimming away excess so that I'm going to finger press. Now I'm going to add that to this section here. And here we go. So there's my first piece. I love doing this. It is really a lot of fun because it just doesn't matter what you put together. The crazier, the better. It's really a freeing sort of quilting where there are no rules. You just enjoy yourself, have fun with it, and start piecing. And the wonderful thing about it is that you are using up scraps from your stash. Everything gets a home, and that I love. So I'm going to trim these apart here. And as you can see, I've got, let me grab my scissors. I like to keep just a regular scissors on hand. I'll trim up some of this extra. The seam allowances, I don't want excess fabric in my seam allowances. You definitely want to trim away any excess. So here are all of these. You could certainly go ahead and press these right now. I'm going to add this one to the bottom of this before I press. You could be so much more free about this too. You don't have to, let me see if I can get my pressing in here. You don't have to be as concerned as I am about what I'm putting together. Just start piecing those crumbs and bits and pieces. A crumb is any size you want it to be. In some cases, my crumbs have to be longer pieces in order to extend across the block. But a crumb is just leftover parts and pieces from previous projects that you have not cut up for your stash. And so here, what I could do with this, I could add this right here, or I could simply take all of these sections, and I guess I have 4 sections here, and I could just grab parts and pieces from my bin and start putting together more parts to the block. So here's one. I'm going to add that one together there. Looks like I'm getting low on bobbin. Let's see what else I have here. I could put this along here and trim away the excess. And I could, if I wanted to, add this under here because there is enough. Yeah. I would need to cut this one apart. So there I've got and I'll trim this up. And you wouldn't have to trim this yet. You could certainly just sew something right there and then trim it later, or you could trim it up now, whatever you choose to do. And here is this. Now we've got this funky little piece here. I'm gonna need to add something on the end of that one to finish that off. And here we have this one. Let's see what I can do here. Let's put this triangle on that one. These tiny little pieces, these can go in your pet pillow for stuffing. They're nice and small, so they won't make your pet pillow lumpy. And I have a pattern in my techniques book, which I've shared with you before. You can make up that pet pillow pattern and then either tape it or clip it to your cutting table or the area around your sewing machine. And then as you're going through and either scrapping up your stash, getting things cut, or as you're going through and crumbing, you can then add these pieces into that pet pillow. And every few months, then you'll have a filled pet pillow that you can sew shut, and your animal, your pet, can enjoy that. So that's where these will go. All right, let's do this one right here. So as you can see, I'm just doing all kinds of crazy things here. I could trim this right now, or I could simply find something that will allow me, I can sew this one here, so that's where it's gonna go. I'm simply trying to find pieces that will fit with other pieces. So you can go through and separate and sort things so that you've got small chunks and then larger chunks, etc. Let's see, this could go right here. I'm going to sew this one on here. And I should end up with 4 additional crumb blocks here within just a few minutes. You can make your crumb blocks as large as you want, and you can create crumb blocks after every project that you make and just keep gathering them until you have enough to put together a quilt. All right, what do we have here? Let's add something to the end of this. Here we go. This one should fit there. So I'm going to go ahead and get it started. And as you can see, I'm going to trim that away, trim that away. And again, these little pieces are going to go in my pet pillow. And so we've got that. Now we're going to need to put something along there. I could certainly make that straight seam. You definitely want to sew straight seams all the time. And let's put this across that seam. And I'm kind of stopping and showing you every time I do a seam, just so you'll have an idea of what I'm doing. But you certainly don't have to do that. You can just continue sewing. If you want to add your selvages into your crumb quilts, go ahead and do that. There's no rule that says you can't. So go ahead and use that if you'd like. And here, I'm going to trim up that seam allowance. I want to get it as close to 1/4 of an inch as possible. I don't need all that extra fabric in my seams. And so this one's kind of really wonky. So I might go through my stash and find a big triangle there that can square this up, and then just keep on going until I've created 4 blocks. And here's what I've got started here. In fact, what I could do here maybe, I guess I'd need to add something along here. Let's add this one here, and then I might be able to add the other piece to this. Let's see what happens here. Whoops. Ah. Let's see if that's made it long enough. That's pretty good. No, it's not. I still need some more width there. Here's a green one. Let's add that at this section on the bottom. I noticed as I was attaching that one that there's a section of that seam that's missing. So I put it on at a slant so that I'm not creating a hole in the middle of my block. There we go. I don't know that this is going to be long enough. It should be close enough. Good enough. I'm going to go ahead and add that there, and then we'll have to straighten out the seam. Whoops. Going to have to fix this and rethread my needle. Be right back. All right, so for this one, I wanted something to kind of square off this side, and I did find a sort of a triangle-shaped piece that I'm going to add over here. And I will probably end up getting rid of the white selvage after I've squared up my block, because I don't want that light on the outside of my block. Having it on the inside isn't so bad, but having it on the outside is not going to work really well with my sashing. So let me sew that. And then here I've just added a red chunk to this side. And I'm going to put the green chunk on that side. Let me turn it over. And I do have my iron set up right next to me here so that I can easily press as I go and continue adding. So that took care of that one. Now I can add this piece out here and sew that. Let's see what this one looks like. There we go. I could simply just remove this white out here and some of that. I could end up putting a strip across there, straight across, and get rid of that light selvage out there, since it's going to be at the outer edge of my quilt. And then I can find some large chunks that I can put here. I have found some weird pieces in my stash. It's kind of a wonky thing. I'm going to go ahead and sew it with another piece of fabric. I've got a couple of those, and make sort of a wonky little half square triangle, if you will. Here's another one. I'm going to go ahead and use them, and then I'll probably trim them up so that they create more of a half square triangle, if you will, when I've got them sewn together. I do have a half square triangle here that has a light. So if I use this in my blocks, I want to make sure that I put it in the center of the block so it's not on the outside edge. And here are some small pieces that I can add to it. Here's a couple of little leftover pieces of triangles. I can make half square triangles with them. And then I can use all of that within the center of my block. So I'm going to go ahead and keep stitching, and then I'll show you as I go how they look. So I've sewn those weird chunks together, and I've go ahead and cut them apart for you so you can see what they all look like and how I will use them. So I'll just press them open and try to sew them together. And that one's kind of a small one. Let me see how this one will work. This one's a little bit bigger. That'll work. I can just get rid of that little part there, he'll go in my pet pillow. I can sew these together. And then maybe I can take the last two here. This one's kind of a long half square triangle. And maybe I can put this with it. Whatever. I can sew these together. I could put it on the very end there and just make it more of a rectangle. So I'll put those together and I'll show you what that ends up looking like. So I have these chunks sewn together and they're pretty wonky, pretty weird, but they're fabulous. Love them. I'm going to trim up some of that excess there and I will press it. Trim up some of that, get rid of that excess seam allowance. Don't need all that excess. I'll press these and then I'm going to sew them together. And I think I'll sew them together like this so the lights are toward the center. And then I'll just keep encasing it with darker values of crumbs all the way around it so that these light pieces are in the center of the block instead of at the outside edge. Because remember, for my blocks, I'm trying to keep the blocks darker around the outside edges that where they're going to be touching the light sashing. As I'm going through here, I'm just trying to give you little tips that'll help you as you encounter these weird things. So I've sewn this together, and you'll notice that this is kind of a curved seam here. And of course, you don't want curved seams in these blocks. You're going to have all kinds of wonky things going on if that happens. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add this strip here, and I'm going to have it go straight down. And I will just sew it straight down that rectangle strip that I've added. And then I will trim away this excess down here and it will be gone. And then I will have a straight edge there that I continue adding fabric to. Let me get that sewn and I'll show you what I mean by that. Here is what I've just sewn. That's got a straight seam there. I pressed it open, but let's first of all get rid of this excess. So I'm going to trim away this excess fabric here, and that will eliminate fabric within the seam allowance. There's a lot of excess seam allowances in any crumb block, so trim away whatever you can as you are working through the block. Now you'll see I have another curve here. So what I'll probably do is add a straight strip here and add some straight strips going to the top. And I'll end up with sort of a long rectangle, and then I can just continue surrounding that rectangle with darker fabrics. And then this lighter fabric is going to be in the center. So that's how you handle weird sections in your crumb block. So here are some of the blocks that I have just crumbed up. They are about, 9 inches each square approximately. So what I want to do with each one of these is to get out my squaring ruler. And what I have here is a 9.5-inch square up ruler. I want to square each of these blocks to 7.5 inches. And as I'm doing this, I'm kind of looking at where my cut lines and seam lines are going to fall so that I'm not right on a seam allowance. So I'll kind of move things around until I can see where I'm not going to be cutting right on a seam allowance. And I kind of like that right there. So I'm going to cut this away. Now I will be able to reuse some of this. Oh, I was going to change my blade. I forgot to do that again. I got to get my blade changed. And there is that one. We're going to get rid of that. This piece here, I can throw back into my crumb bin. This one I can chop up and put in my pet pillow. And this can be twisted around, and I'm going to square it up to 7.5 inches. I'm a little close right here to a seam allowance, but it'll be okay. You do deal with a lot of seam allowances in a crumb quilt. I don't ever, or so far, I have not submitted any crumb quilts for contests because there's just so many weird things that happen in a crumb quilt. Personally, I think they're just wonderful for using as generosity projects, wonderful projects for family. So I recommend using them in that fashion. So there is a 7.5-inch block that is ready to go. And I'm going to do that with all of these. First, I am going to change my blade in here so that I can cut this without getting so frustrated with my rotary cutter. So I'm going to get all of these squared up, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to be creating sashings for our blocks. And I've got some started here, and I'll show you how I've done that. As you're creating your crumb quilt, you don't have to sash the blocks. You can simply put all the crumb quilt blocks together and create a beautiful quilt. I chose to sash mine, and so I wanted to make some 2-inch sashing, and you can do that in a variety of ways. As you see here, I've pieced together a number of things. I've gathered some narrower pieces, put them together and made them wider. I could add another section here along the length of this, and that would end up making this pieced section 4 inches wide, which is what I would need to cut it in half, and then I would have 2 sashings. So you could do that, or you could simply gather the crumbs that you have in your bin that are the size that you want them to be in the width, and just start piecing them together, crumbing them together, and making long strips. This is one that's almost 4 inches. I think I should probably add one more strip here just to make sure that it's completely 4 inches. And then I can simply cut it and make sure that it's completely 2 inches wide all the way up and down by whatever length. I'm going to need some of the longer sashings to go between the rows, and I'm going to need the 7.5-inch sections that we'll be using between each of the blocks. Before I sash my blocks together, I thought I'd show you on this one 4-inch wide section how I cut them. And you know what? I don't think it's completely 4 inches on this side. I think I'm going to have to make some adjustments there. But I'll quickly show you what I would do. So I'm going to lay it on there. I'm going to try to keep that 2-inch mark away from a seam allowance if possible. It's harder on these sashings because of how they're being put together. So there I have 2 of them. This one I know is 2 inches wide all the way. This one is not 2 inches wide down here. So I might have to rip that section off, but I could still use the bottom here and subcut it. Or I could piece together lots of these so I have the length that I need across the quilt, and then subcut 2-inch wide sections from them to create my sashing that's going to go across in between the blocks. So now let's take a look at how you can put your blocks together with your sashings. And I start out with a sashing on the outside, and I simply, you've done this all, I'm sure all of you have done this, where you're sashing rows together with your blocks. I'm simply putting the 7.5-inch section in between each of my blocks, and I'm going to sew it together in one big long row. Then I'm going to need to have one very long sashing for and in between the rows, and one on this side as well, and just continue sewing my blocks together in that fashion. And that's how you create the blocks. That's how you sash them together. If you don't use the crumb sashing, you're just going to use regular fabric. And if you plan to sash, and just cut your fabric pieces to the width and the length of the width that you prefer your sashing to be, and the length of whatever your blocks happen to be. Mine, as I mentioned before, are 7.5 inches. So I'm cutting my sashing 2 inches wide. That just happened to be the size I wanted, by 7.5 inches long. And then this row here is going to have to be, it's about 2 inches wide, and it's going to have to be as long as the quilt is, depending on how many blocks you're going to put in your quilt. So as you can see here, I've got one more row that I have added to my design wall of the blocks with the side sashing that I've attached to each of these crumb blocks. And I do have already sewn to the bottom of the quilt this sashing. So I've got that row of sashing that extends all the way across. So I can just sew this to that, and then I'll need to add another row of sashing down here. And then I have enough blocks that I can do one more row once that's done. And then I'm going to finish my borders. Hopefully I'll have a complete picture for you of this by the time I load the video today. One other thing I wanted to point out is I have located a large tub of scraps that I have been gathering over the last year or so, and I really need to get those scrapped up. So I'm hoping you'll all join me next week as I load a video where I'm going to be sharing with you step by step how I go through this tub and scrap up my stash, how I get them cut, sorted, organized, stored, and I'm going to show you how I use up my crumbs and store my crumbs as well. There's so much that you can do with every scrap that you have in your studio. Nothing has to go to waste. Everything can find a home. I've put my quilt center together here, and it is sitting in front of another quilt behind there, so don't get confused with the funny borders that are on that quilt behind it. This is on a white design wall here, and the outside borders are these dark borders. I wanted to go 5 blocks by 5 blocks. I still have extra blocks, but I didn't have enough border fabric. If you remember, I mentioned with this border fabric, I just had a chunk and I wanted to use the whole chunk. And so I've been able to put it together. It's a good size. This makes a nice size baby quilt here. And so I've got it put together. I'm going to get it up on the quilt frame, but I just wanted you to see what it looks like. So each block within the quilt is sashed all the way around with some lighter value fabrics, and I just used up a ton of my crumbs, lots of my stash. And I'm going to take it outside and take a picture of it where it's not in front of another quilt, so you can get a better look of it. And that's a photo that you'll see in the thumbnail as well. It's at the end of the video here. But hopefully you have enjoyed putting this together with me. I hope that you have been working on these wonderful crumb blocks as we have gone through the Strip Up Your Stash series, and you've had a number of them gathered and ready to go so you can make this fun project. I'd love to see pictures of what you're working on. Please don't forget to post them out on my Facebook group page, Quilting with Lori, and it's Scrap Up Your Stash. I would also like to see if you're making them larger, maybe you're doing pillows, whatever it is you're doing. And with those leftover blocks that I have, I'm going to show you over the next couple of months another fun way to put a quilt together using those crumb blocks. So I hope you'll join me next time as I scrap up my stash with this container of crumbs, or actually lots of different scrap pieces here. They're remnants from previous projects, and I'm going to get that all cut, sorted, organized, and ready to go in my scrap stash. And I hope you'll watch that and just work along in your scrap stash and get yours cut, sorted, and organized as well. Along with that, we're going to be gathering baskets of crumbs that we can use for more crumb blocks. So stay tuned for those videos that are coming up. If you do like the projects that I have been presenting for you and the content on my channel, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And it doesn't cost anything to subscribe. I have that question asked of me often. Subscribing is free. It just helps my channel to be able to grow and to get to other quilters just like yourself. So I really appreciate your doing that. Thank you so much. And don't forget to comment. Let me know what you're working on, if you're going to be doing some crumb quilting, if you'll be joining me for my Scrapping Up Your Stash next week. And I'd love to hear from you. So until next time, happy quilting.